yes, there is a higher than expected number of pregnancy losses that are associated with vaccination in early pregnancy, particularly the first trimester. In Israel, it is still recommended for all women at any age and any stage of pregnancy. There has been no official response, not by the vaccine manufacturer nor the public health officials. Now, we don't know, again, the mechanisms of action here. So is it something specific to the spike protein that is being produced, or is it something else that's more related to the lipid nanoparticles or the technology of an mRNA vaccine? We don't know.
I'm Dr. Randall Bock. I'm going to have the esteemed PhD doctor, Josh Guetzkow. And he is speaking to me from oftentimes beleaguered, but plucky, amazing place, Israel. I think he's in Tel Aviv, which is Hebrew for Spring Hill, something like that.
That's right.
I was there in 2020 before the big bad wolf of the COVID pandemic. There's been a lot of stuff going on since then. I think it turned Josh's focus perhaps from his erstwhile studies. He'll have to clarify this for me, but I think it's criminology or something like that, onto a little bit more public health focus. And he's going to help us focus on some public health, perhaps. I follow him closely on X, and we'll give you his handle and so forth as we go on. But Josh, tell us what has been top of mind lately, and what was the recent study you published regarding COVID vaccines and pregnancy?
Hi, Randy. Thanks for talking with me today. So you're right. I do have a background in criminology, sociology, but I also have a background in public health. After I got my PhD, I did a 2-year postdoc at Harvard in a public health policy postdoctoral program. So I definitely have that in my background. When the COVID, COVID started hitting the airwaves, and we started hearing about COVID, and they were sort of increasing the concerns about COVID, just as a, at a basic level of data analysis, I could see all of the different problems with the way that they were announcing the increasing number of cases, but of course they were also increasing the number of people getting tested, and they weren't, taking that into account in any way. So it just was just so absurd and bizarre. So, it kind of like sparked my spidey sense, as it were. Mm-hmm. And when the COVID vaccines rolled out, I started looking at VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, and the European reporting system, and seeing just all these reports just rolling in. And that made me question what was going on here. So, one thing led to another, and here I am. So the study that we just released as a preprint, so it's not peer reviewed yet. It was released on medRxiv, and it is a study of fetal losses, or could call them pregnancy losses, looking at women vaccinated for COVID-19 and whether or not getting vaccinated for COVID-19 during pregnancy increases the rate of fetal loss. And we found that, yes, there is a higher than expected number of pregnancy losses that are associated with vaccination in early pregnancy, particularly the first trimester. And we specifically look at weeks 8 to 13. I can tell you why if you want to know. And what we find is that women who received dose 1 of the mRNA COVID vaccine, particularly Pfizer, because that was what was given in Israel, women vaccinated for COVID in the first trimester, weeks 8 to 13, had 4 additional fetal losses. Like, they eventually lost their pregnancy So there were 4 additional losses per 100 women who were vaccinated during that period of pregnancy. So that's a huge increase, 4 out of 100. So instead of here, I'll show you a quick visual. Essentially, we were expecting to see 9 fetal losses per 100 women who received the first dose, and what we saw is that there were 13 additional. I'm sorry, there were 13 total, or 4 additional fetal losses that were actually observed in those women. And we did a similar analysis for dose 2, and the number is very similar because most of the women who went on to get dose 1 also got dose 2, and so it's sort of the same difference. And then we also looked at dose 3, and there we saw a slightly smaller difference. We saw an increase of 2. So instead of 10 expected fetal losses, we observed 12 fetal losses per 100 women. So these numbers are quite telling, and the story even gets worse because these additional fetal losses didn't occur. Let's put it differently. These fetal losses occurred throughout pregnancy, and so some of them occurred close to the time of vaccination, but over half of them occurred after week 19. Okay, so starting from week 20, over half of this additional 4 occurred later in pregnancy. So essentially, we're talking stillbirths. So a lot of this higher than expected number is happening later in pregnancy, what are called stillbirths. And almost half of that difference occurred after starting at week 25. And that's important because the measure that we use is pregnancy loss. So it could include a miscarriage. It could include a stillbirth. It could include an induced abortion for medical reasons or for elective, right? Women just deciding that she doesn't want to carry. And there's a reason we do that I won't get into, but when you look at later fetal losses, what you can say for certain is that was not an elective choice of the women. Right. In Israel, it's very, very rare to have an elective abortion, even after week 14, especially after week 20. But from week 25 onwards, it's simply there's a regulation, there's a law against it. Like you can't just get an elective abortion from week 25. So we're able to say with a great deal of certainty that most of this difference cannot be attributed to an elective choice of women, which means that it must be driven by biological reasons. What those reasons are, we don't know. We can't tell from our study. But there are indications. There was a study that just came out earlier this year showing that mRNA vaccines cross through the placenta and can cause all kinds of issues with the reproductive health of a baby's development.
Has there been any response from, I guess, public health apparatus in Israel or from the vaccine manufacturers? And are these vaccines still being promoted to be given across the board and for women of reproductive age in Israel?
Right.
Here, there's been a little bit of a clampdown, well deserved and far too late in just not recommending the COVID-19 vaccinations for young children and for pregnant women or women of childbearing age in the U.S. And there's already like a blowback from the various American colleges of X, Y, and Z, pediatrics and so forth. So it's just funny. I think they want to sue RFK Jr. Over that. But yeah, anyway, tell me what the situation is.
Yeah, I saw that. Also, the Japanese health agency recently changed their recommendation. They're no longer recommending for pregnant women. Of course, in the U.S., a woman, basically they said, well, go and talk to your doctor. But the doctor is going to do what their, board certifying institutions tell them, organizations. So they're going to recommend it. In Israel, it is still recommended for all women at any age and any stage of pregnancy. And there has been no official response, not by the vaccine manufacturer nor the public health officials in Israel, at least. Maybe once this actually gets published, it'll get more traction. One of the problems is that, oh, wait, before I go on to one of the problems, I want to just point out that in Israel, they started vaccinating the population in mid-December, mainly the elderly population, and then they started bringing down the age range. And so by mid-January, they were already recommending women in the second and third trimesters be vaccinated with essentially no evidence to support the safety of vaccination in women. Remember that the original Pfizer trial and the Moderna trial as well, they did not include pregnant women. They specifically excluded them. They took a pregnancy test when they were enrolling women to make sure that they weren't vaccinating pregnant women. Later, Pfizer did a clinical trial, but they only enrolled like 170 women, all of whom started vaccinating in um, late in the second trimester, early third trimester. So there was no evidence. There still is very poor evidence, especially for vaccination in early childhood. So that was mid-January. They recommended it for women in the second and third trimesters, and it later came out that the only reason they weren't recommending it for women in the first trimester is because women are much more likely to have a miscarriage in the first trimester. They didn't want anybody to erroneously, quote unquote, connect the vaccination to a miscarriage and give raise concern about the vaccination. But it didn't take them very long to get over that, because 2 weeks later, February 1st, they were already recommending it for all women, all pregnant women at all ages, at all stages of pregnancy. And that recommendation, as far as I'm aware, stands today. Now, the problem with getting traction on this is that there's been a lot of research on it. Less research on early pregnancy, but still, there's been a lot of research on COVID vaccination and pregnancy based on what you call real world data. So it's not a clinical trial, it's based on electronic health records like ours. Ours is based on the electronic health records of women in Israel's second largest HMO. It's called Maccabi. Has about 2.6 million members. So most of this is based on the sort of real world data. And the studies come out fine. They see there's no problem. They find no problem with vaccinating women during pregnancy. But there are a lot of problems with these studies. One of the big problems with the studies is that they only look at, so for example, if they do look at vaccination in early pregnancy, they essentially will only look a few weeks after vaccination to see if there was a problem a few weeks after vaccination. But what we're finding is that the harm, it appears to be spread out across the pregnancy. So if you the one study I can think of stops at week 19. They look at vaccination early in pregnancy, but they don't look what happens past week 19. Well, according to our findings, you would miss half the signal just by arbitrarily stopping at that point. Or if you only look at women vaccinated later in pregnancy, you'll miss what happens to the developing fetus if you vaccinate early in pregnancy. So that's one of the main problems of the existing research. There are other problems. One of the other major problems that we try to address is this known problem of the healthy vaccinee bias, or the healthy vaccinee effect. Are you familiar with this?
I have a sense of what you're talking about, but I'll let you carry on.
So basically, it's a known phenomenon. It's well established in the literature that people who get vaccinated tend to be healthier on average than people who don't. Not necessarily because they're getting vaccinated, but they sort of have these sort of, they're
Yeah.
health conscious, conscientious, health seeking,
Right.
in ways that are sometimes hard to measure. So, for example, I have a friend who every year he wants to renew his health insurance. He has to fill out a survey, and one question they always ask him is, "Do you floss your teeth?" It's not because he has dental coverage. It's because it's an indicator of
Yeah.
somebody who takes care of themselves, right? And sort of these hard to measure ways. And so, what if it's the case that women who get in pregnancy who tend to get vaccinated sort of tend to be healthier on average, and also during pregnancy things can change. Women who are having problems with their pregnancy, maybe they're having bleeding, cramping, I don't know. probably less likely to go out and get vaccinated, but everything's hunky-dory and you're feeling good and you're feeling great and you want to go out and get vaccinated.
Mhm.
And you go, okay. So, so here's the problem. Okay, let me cut to the chase. Most of these studies compare women vaccinated, like during the big vaccination drives, they compare women who got vaccinated and women who didn't. And when you do that, if there is a healthy vaccinee bias, you make the vaccines look better than they are, because the women are already healthier to begin with, or their pregnancies are doing better than to begin with. And so you bias your results when you make that comparison. And also there's another problem. You can't really compare them for very long, but that's something separate. Now, how do we deal with that in our study? What we do is we look at women who were vaccinated for influenza during the COVID period. Okay. That deals with another objection, which is COVID was such a unique period. How can you compare women? So essentially, what we're using is this method called observed to expected comparisons. This is a well-known epidemiological tool for examining safety of vaccines and other products, where you basically look at a historical expected
Mhm.
amount of adverse events over a given period, and then you compare that to the amount that you actually observe. If you observe more, like I saw there were 60 cases of myocarditis among this group, and we should have only seen 3. There's a signal, right? So we do something similar. It's a bit more sophisticated, but the point is that we're coming up with this expected number of fetal losses or pregnancy losses based on historical data. And people come to us and say, well, wait a second. The COVID period was so unique. There's so much going on. How can you compare it to what was happening in the past? And so one of our ways of responding to that and looking at the healthy vaccinee effect is by looking at the influenza vaccination. We do the same analysis, but with influenza vaccination during the COVID period. And what we find is strikingly different to what we found with the COVID vaccinations. What we find with influenza vaccinations is that instead of a higher than expected number of pregnancy losses, we see a much lower number of pregnancy losses. So instead of 4 additional fetal losses, we see about 5 fewer fetal losses. And now, why do I think so? What does this have to do with the healthy vaccinee bias? Doesn't it just mean that the influenza vaccination protects pregnant women from influenza, and that's why they're having fewer than expected fetal losses? But here's the catch. If you'll recall, during the COVID years, there was like no influenza, right? I think 2021 they said
Mhm.
it, or 2020 it
Well, at
just
least they stopped
disappeared,
dying.
right?
They either
Or at
stopped
least they
existing or
stopped,
stopped
right? I mean,
diagnosing it,
what?
or it got
Okay,
conflated and put in a different bucket.
right. I mean, we could argue the finer points of that, but they were telling us at least that there was basically no influenza, especially for one of those years. And what we did is we repeated our analysis for an earlier influenza year, 2018 to 2019, which was actually a bad influenza year, and we find the same difference. We
Right.
find this, right?
Well,
We find the same outcome.
I would in Israel, who wasn't vaccinated. My understanding was there was pretty broad societal acceptance and a push in a sense, and without engaging in stereotypes, it seemed like Israel was getting such a deal. They were getting kind of a special deal. Albert Bourla, if I'm pronouncing it correct, erstwhile head of Pfizer, seemed to have gotten in some kind of conjoint agreement with Israel because Israel is so technologically advanced and has this high participation rate in EHRs, medical records, and whatnot, that they could pull and cull and observe the data and so forth. So you are in a unique spot in Israel, for better for worse, in many different aspects. We'll get to some of the other aspects later, but in regard to the COVID-19 episode. Now, there's also different subtype and subpopulation both within the Israeli Jewish population and without. So the Arab Israeli population and or the territories run by PLO and that other group, not to be named, but perhaps kind of rhymes with Hamassacre. Um, but in those other population, areas, there was less vaccine penetration. I'm not sure people did worse as a result of not of lower vaccination rates, either amongst the Haredi, i.e., kind of Orthodox Jewish community, which may have abjured the vaccine. But tell me how much of that flowed into and swirled amongst your data set.
All right. So we have our data set only includes Israeli citizens. So that does include the 2+ million Arab Israelis, and it includes the Jewish population, including the Haredi population. And we can identify to a fair degree of accuracy between those groups. We haven't looked to see if our results differ according to the different subgroups, but we do see a lower vaccination take up among the Haredi population and among the Arab Israeli population. As far as the PLO, the sort of Gaza and the West Bank, we see. I think people have looked at this, and my memory is a little bit fuzzy, but I believe the claim was they hardly got any vaccines, and they didn't have a significant COVID impact in terms of COVID. By the way, our analysis that we do, this observed to expected, we also looked at COVID vaccinations. Sorry, not COVID vaccination. SARS-CoV-2 infections during pregnancy, and we find no difference. There's no increase or decrease, no higher than expected, lower. It's very basically it's a similar to expected number of fetal losses. So SARS-CoV-2 infections in first and second trimester don't seem, in our data, in our analysis, were not deleterious.
So there's also the other aspect in those other, say non-bourgeois or whatever, kind of mainstream Israeli Jewish population of younger pregnancies,
Yes.
both amongst Israeli Arabs and amongst Haredi Jews. So are we just looking at the fact that younger women have better pregnancy retention than older women?
No, and I'll tell you why. So the way that we do our analysis, so I was telling you about this observed to expected, where you generate a expected number or expected rate of an adverse event based on historical data. And the way that this tends to be done, for example, the CDC did this when they were looking at myocarditis in the summer of 2021. They adjust for age, they adjust for sex, but that's about it. And what our model, so we use historical, very detailed individual level data to build a statistical model that predicts a woman's likelihood of pregnancy loss at any point during pregnancy based on her individual characteristics, her age, smoking status, comorbidities, all kinds of stuff. So based on a woman's individual characteristics, the timing of her conception, and the week of pregnancy, because as you know, if you're early on in pregnancy, you have a much higher risk of losing your pregnancy at some point as opposed to later on. So you really need to take that into account, and existing research hasn't done a very careful job of doing that. So we built this model that predicts for any given woman, based on her individual characteristics, what is her probability of losing the pregnancy. And then we take all the women, we add them up, we say, okay, you were vaccinated on week 8, and so now this is the number. These women were vaccinated on week 8. This is the number of pregnancy losses we should expect to see, and this is the number that we actually see. And so we're already adjusting for things like age and stuff like that when we generate our expected numbers. So it's not just an issue of age or something like that.
Fair enough. So just to kind of backtrack and to summarize for our listeners and viewers, are these vaccinations only obtained during pregnancy? Or are these women who have had certain numbers of vaccinations at other times and then become pregnant?
Right.
I apologize for not knowing this because you have been telling me, but I somehow that filtered away as I was looking at
It's
the
not a
slides.
problem. And your audience is probably wondering something simpler. And one of the questions that we get is, well, what about if you get vaccinated before pregnancy? So we don't see a signal We don't see a significant difference between observed and expected for women vaccinated before pregnancy. We don't see a signal, if we look at all women, we don't see a difference. So our model is doing a very good job. And if we look at unvaccinated women, we also don't see a difference. We're only seeing a difference for if women vaccinated during a particular period during pregnancy. Um, and so we're looking at women vaccinated in pregnancy. Now, when we look at dose 3, then what we're looking at women who were vaccinated with doses 1 and 2 prior to pregnancy, and then they were vaccinated with dose 3 during pregnancy. And now, what's interesting is that the difference that we see, right, the difference that we observe for the third dose is about half of what it is for the first dose, and that actually suggests a potential dose response relationship. Okay, because if you think about it, a woman who received dose 3 during pregnancy only received 1 dose during pregnancy. But a woman who received dose 1, most of them also received dose 2. And so they're basically getting a double dose. And so you see this difference is larger. So that's also a concerning signal from our analysis.
So, how much of this is going on still? Or are we just kind of looking at a cohort of 2020, 2021, let's say principally 2021 and 22 or something like that? Is there still a phenomenon of people getting at a young age, whatever, COVID vaccinations, which I found absurd to begin with, especially since the risk of getting ill from the COVID-19, as it were, and its various Greek letter congeners coming thereafter, the alpha, beta,
Right.
delta, so forth versions, and even particular, Omicron, which I maintain is, not even a relation genomically to SARS-CoV-2. I think it's a sui generis, that is to say, nothing to do with being generous, but of its own type. It's an unrelated coronavirus, such as always existed prior to 2003 SARS, classic SARS, like classic Coke, or the 2019-2020 versions and thereafter. So is this still happening? So I guess is there a take-home message of current warning to people, or is it just like, hey, we shouldn't do this kind of experiment again? Should we get something like this? I mean, how relevant is it
Both.
for
I
current?
mean, okay. So we are. One thing is we don't know the mechanism of action here. We don't know if, assuming this is a causal relationship that we're observing, we can't say that with certainty based on the analysis. Though we do believe it points strongly towards that, but assuming it's causal, we don't know what the mechanisms of action are. So I personally would recommend, and I'm not a physician, but I don't see how you could see the results of this uh, paper and say, well, okay, as long as I don't get vaccinated early in pregnancy, I'm okay. We don't know the mechanisms of action, and so we don't actually know it could result in other forms of harm to a fetus or developing baby later in pregnancy. That we our analysis was just confined to this outcome of pregnancy loss. So there could be other things going on that we don't capture. So that's one thing. Another thing is that in Israel, very few people are getting vaccinated with the boosters at this point, including pregnant women. But not as necessarily. Especially, I think it's a bit more common in the U.S. I know somebody who saw last year in the fall somebody at Walgreens, a pregnant woman in Walgreens, waiting to get her COVID vaccination. I know we get emails, to encourage us to take our boosters here, but the take up is very low. I don't know the percentages off the top of my head, but there's a future issue because now the industry is moving to develop more and more mRNA based products. Now we don't know again the mechanisms of action here. So is it something specific to the spike protein that that is being produced, or is it something else that's more related to the lipid nanoparticles or the technology of an mRNA vaccine? We don't know. So I think it has great relevance for pregnant women down the line who are going to be presented with a choice of whether or not to get an mRNA vaccination in pregnancy. And then I think there's a big question mark over that.
So if we were to kind of put a caption or warning label like they do in cigarette packs or something like that, um, what would it be for the general public? And I mean, not just specifically on this vaccination, but on perhaps public health propaganda or measures or politicization, that might be generated down the line. And is there anything to do post hoc, aside from avoid future COVID-19 vaccinations? So what's your general take home message? And I'd like to, kind of veer into some other topics aside from this. So if we were to close out this topic alone, how would you frame it? What's your, warning to the public in general, to the politicians who promote this, to the pharmaceuticals? That's three different P's, although pharmaceutical doesn't sound like it. Pfizer's got another P. How would you phrase this? And is there a reckoning to be had in any
There
live?
should be a reckoning to be had. I mean, just taking a step back, I think, and so what we're finding, right, is that mRNA COVID vaccinations in early pregnancy appear to be associated with an increase in fetal loss. But taking a step back, we have to think like we don't treat we treat pregnant women extraordinarily carefully in medicine, right? You're not supposed to eat sushi, you don't drink wine, you stay away from cat litter, all of these things. And yet this precautionary principle, which is we normally are supposed to take a precautionary principle, but especially when we're talking about pregnant women, was just completely thrown out the window.
Yeah.
And they rushed headlong into these recommendations. And so I think the big lesson for people is try to ignore the fear mongering and think, wait a second, this is what do we really know about this thing? What do we really know about this new? And if it's not mRNA COVID vaccination, it could be something else.
Yeah.
Newborns are precious, and
Yeah, and almost
fetuses.
everybody I know, probably without any exceptions, almost everybody I know was born through a pregnancy. Let me think. Yeah, I think that's true. I can say that with fair confidence that everybody I know was born of a mother and was born through pregnancy, and to varying extents, the mother was careful. Um, there's all kinds of care for this, and the reason we do almost everything is to create a foundation. We build a shelter from what? For whom? We need to protect those that are vulnerable. And if we don't do that, I think we've lost our bearings. I think part of the reckoning that should occur with COVID-19 is this I'm going to come up with a word here, an upside down attitude, a reversal of roles and priorities and focus from top down to bottom up. If that makes sense, to say, we during the time my mother-in-law was with us, and she'd been for a decade. She died naturally of other causes after the COVID kerfuffle, brouhaha, and she would have had 18 vaccines if they were on offer. She had her share
Wow.
of them. I mean, she and from my taste, she was welcome to them. She was in her 90s, and there's very little downside risk. It would be almost immeasurable to see if there's any change in her long-term, life expectancy, because she'd already had a long-term life. On the other hand, a 9-year-old is in the opposite situation, and we have to, do our best to care and protect them, because if there's a variation of 5% in their life expectancy, you're talking about, say 5 years. And if there's a 5% chance, change in a 90-year-old's life expectancy, you may be talking about 5 days. And those are different amounts from I can do the math again. I'm being, challenged to struggle here. And I think that is probably true. And so, societally, we had to do all kinds of contortions. And I don't want to kill Granny, my own kid's granny or anybody else's in particular. I did my best to keep my kid's granny alive as long as we could, and we did. But on the other hand, I don't think she really would have wanted her own grandkids to have been confined and constrained in the ways that they were. They're dating their potential mating, their school, their education, all that kind of stuff was bound in by the precepts of what was to be done for the elderly. And I don't think we did the elderly that much by taking away the love and touch and celebrations that they all missed out on. But I'd like to take a little bit of a segue from the concerns over and mind you, I think the absurdity of putting a new formulation, a new modality of type of vaccination, if you want to call COVID-19 formulations vaccinations, which I think they probably are, but they were mRNA platform where there's no need for it. We had the old formulations that had been adequate to making flu shots over the years, and we were able to produce the adenovirus vector vaccine in the same time frame of warp speed, as it were, that we produced the mRNA one. So there's no benefit to that. And there was this kind of experimentation aspect that, I think it was a kind of a Trojan horse aspect. The one term is called instrumentalism, and it was kind of Dr. Fauci, I think, in part covering his tuchus, to use a term, of having had complicity in the formulation and foundation and derivation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself, gain of function, either in Fort Detrick in the U.S. or in China or both. And I think he wanted to come out as the hero and bring the mRNA type of treatment to the fore and use us as an experimentation platform. And I think that all the signs pointed towards keeping us naive as much as possible, locked down literally. Saw a public health conception which had never occurred, frankly, in public health as a prison term, to have a lockdown and to keep the population under lock because they're in prison to begin with, but had never really been tried, except I think once in Freetown, Sierra Leone, during an Ebola episode, but that was temporary, and they let people out for Friday mosque services and Saturday church services, and Sunday church services, and I don't think there were any Jews there for Saturday. Anyway, but these are things that had never happened. But along the way, I think we may see some benefit for mRNA down the road, but it has to be something for which the risk is high enough to take the problem of the illness would give us enough benefit to take on the risk of the formulation itself, for which we do not know. But you were involved in 22 and 23, I think, with looking at some of the other aspects of the COVID vaccine. And again, Israel had some of the best database aspects to determine other things that were going on. There were these FIFA athletes, soccer athletes, and so forth, which seemed to be, dropping dead at higher rates than ever before. If you look on, PolitiFact and whatnot, all these fact-based checkers, they seem to poo-poo that. I'm wondering if that's the case. And then there were also studies, again, principally from Israel, that showed that there was more myocarditis happening in young males that, again, exceeded the benefit they were getting from the vaccine. So tell me if there's any fodder there for you to go through.
Well, actually, the last time that we spoke was about the FIFA, the soccer athletes and the heart problems that they had. And I showed you an analysis that we had done. So one of the problems with that, I said it last time I was talking with you, I'll say it again. I had an early take on that. It was based on a very sloppy analysis that I still regret, that people throw in my face, said, you came up with this. And I was like, yeah, that was a mistake. But subsequent to that, I had a chance to look at the issue much, much more carefully. So there are a couple of things. One is, they show these videos of athletes dropping on the field, and the assumption that people make, the implication is that those people drop dead. But in most cases that one looks at, they don't drop dead. They fall. They have to be taken off. They often have to be taken off the field, but they're back on their feet within a couple of days, and nobody knows exactly what happened to them. And so when you include those types of events in your count of what's happening to the athletes, if you just look at deaths, you probably won't see an increase. But there's something going on, whether it's pulmonary, whether it's cardiac. There definitely is this increase in these types of issues happening. Very careful counting. There was another analysis that I'm actually working on right now, using a soccer player database called Transfer Market that tracks medical problems of soccer players, and you can definitely see there a very clear increase in cardiac related problems, and they also have COVID-19, and you can see that this is not something that is due to COVID-19 infections. It's something else. We, one believes, easy to say it. It's the COVID vaccinations. One reason it's easy to pin it on it is one of my co-authors on this paper on pregnancy loss is Professor Recep Levy at MIT, and he is now a member of the American, the Advisory Council on Immunization
ACIP,
Practice, right,
yeah,
the ACIP
ACIP
Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and he did an analysis using ambulance data, EMS data from Israel, showing this big spike in cardiac related calls among in Israel for ambulances, among the age groups that just coincident with their they're getting vaccinated in Israel during that period, and that was published. And that shows a very, very strong signal of cardiac risk. And of course, there's lots of other studies that have been published. Yeah, I think I covered your questions. I think I addressed what
right.
you
So,
asked.
so
Maybe there's something
here
I
we
left
had
out.
I think Super Bowl, the Super Bowl the pre-Super Bowl game a year and a half ago was one in which the Bills, I think, faced up against. It was the end of the year of the previous calendar football year, so it was late 2023 that Damar Hamlin, quote
Yeah.
unquote, dropped dead, and of course that couldn't be a vaccine. But both that episode and, frankly, my interview with Recep Levy about 2.5 years ago, they both bladed my channels over various of the social media, YouTube,
Oh
Facebook,
wow.
because I didn't come out and say what had caused the problem with Damar Hamlin, but I went over a commodio cordis, which is kind of the potential heart
Yeah.
stop from a direct blow, and looked at the history of it, and it has happened here and there, but the frequency is happening more since the COVID vaccination and whatnot. And I had Recep Levy, and he had pointed out that kids shouldn't be getting this vaccination. They don't really get ill from the illness. Why vaccinate them against something for which they don't really have any problems? And that that ruined my LinkedIn. Like, I was just
Oh wow.
blissed from LinkedIn. I actually use LinkedIn. I'm not as much anymore, I guess, because I'm a little bit tentative about it and shy about doing too much if they're just going to. And there was no entry point. It was kind of like being dropped into a smooth well, without even the bricks, like from the lore. They didn't give you any notice. It was all gone, and there's nothing back with which to climb, because you only have this one name, this one LinkedIn aspect to you. So it's very tied to your identity, and you can't
Yeah.
make a new name. I'll be Bandy Rock or something like that and try to get back onto LinkedIn. It's not any use if they don't have it.
Yeah.
So it's just one of those things. There are no aliases and whatnot on LinkedIn. And it's only when I kind of, to use a nice word, kind of bitched and yelled or whatever on some of the other social media and got other people to climb on, that LinkedIn suddenly mysteriously said, "Oh, we're so sorry," and they let me back on.
Oh
So
wow.
yeah, without the what is it, streetcar named Desire, without the kindness of strangers, I would have been off LinkedIn forever, I guess. And so they have this tendency of shutting people up and whatnot, and it's just a sadness. The weird thing is the WHO followed on Recep Levy's, either because of him or just coincidentally. They took all his recommendations, and they stopped recommending for kids like a month or two later, after YouTube had blitzed my channel, ruined all my subscribers. I had to start afresh and whatnot. And it's just kind of a scramble. And I think, similar stuff happened on Twitter at the time. It was not X yet. Anyway, so that there's, a story for you. I've met Recep in person. He's actually a reasonable physical neighbor here, but we don't meet and greet locally too much. But I'm certainly happy that he's on board there. So let's kind of veer in our last summary of minutes here. last 8 or 10 minutes or so, and talk a little bit about the politics thereof. We have had a kind of a restoration, I'd call it, politically here with Trump 47, and I'm wondering, what goes on Israel. Obviously, there are bigger things on the plate. If you want to look at it, just a public health aspect, sure, you can talk about vaccination, but I think the bigger public health challenge is not having missiles fall on your head, that kind of stuff. So maybe tell us, if you have any perspective about whether there's been any kind of realization on the current, political front about all this stuff that happened, and whether there are any regrets.
There's essentially been zero any kind of what would be the right what's the word I'm looking for here. Nobody, no politician has acknowledged any problems, and there hasn't been so much as a committee of inquiry or anything like that. There was a report and an investigation by the state comptroller who found the system that was put in place to track adverse events from the COVID vaccines was pitifully under inadequate, to put it mildly, to deal with the issues, to really track adverse events in a good way. And this was something that we had. I wasn't directly involved in it, but people in Israel had brought tried to bring to the public's attention quite some time ago. So there's been no political. Nobody's had to come to account politically for this. There's really no recognition, except in very alternative media channels. But there is a widespread public recognition that nobody's going out to get vaccinated for COVID. Nobody's getting. Very, very few people are getting their boosters, and so there's a widespread, I think, collapse in the public's trust in that, and a concomitant reduction in childhood vaccinations. There's been a that confidence in vaccinations overall has been damaged by the COVID vaccine fiasco. But you have to keep in mind that just like Trump, tried to make a lot of capital out of his warp speed and bringing the COVID vaccines to market so quickly. Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister, who was also prime minister at the beginning of the COVID period, boasted and still boasts about making this deal with Pfizer to bring all of these vaccinations and getting the public vaccinated in the fastest and the best and the most and whatever. And so, what is he going to say? He's never going to admit, he's never going to own up to the fact that was a complete disaster. The opposition was completely behind it as well. And when they got power in early 2021, they just went full throttle with it and did the Green Pass and all of that. So it was a bipartisan. So this is one of the big differences in Israel versus the US, is that there was some partisanship. There was some polarization around the vaccine issue. In Israel, it wasn't like that at all. It was right, left, everybody. Maybe there was some, in the Arab sector, in the ultra-Orthodox sector, that were skeptical of it, but they weren't sort of opposed to it, and there was no organized opposition to all of the lockdown measures and that sort of thing. So politically, it was very different. There's no comeuppance or coming clean about it on the horizon. All we can do is press forward and try to bring information to light. I feel like there was something I wanted to add, but now I don't remember what it was. So go ahead.
So maybe take the last 5 minutes and give us a boots on the ground view from Israel. If I had to script this, I don't think I could. Going back to, it's my father's birthday, October 7th, my late father's. And so there was always a day of celebration for our family. And I have a niece with the same birthday, and so that kind of continued. But it's become one of those days like 7/7 in England. It's a funny but sad video that Guetzkow pointed out of Nigel Farage lamenting 7/7, and we should learn the lessons of quote unquote extremism and so forth. And Guetzkow said, "Can you tell us the name of that extremism?" And you guys might be able to name it. been on the the blunt end of manipulations of Iran through Hamas and through Hezbollah, and I just didn't see a way out of that. Having kind of those two prongs right at your throat, and then the potential of nuclear, weapons being shuttled over. It just seemed like an inevitable or impossible to move mountain. And yet here we are a little bit later. I'm not sure that it's completely been defanged and whatnot. But maybe you could tell us what that journey's been like for you. I mean, there are public health aspects to this because people don't really have a public health if they don't live.
Right. Um, it's been it's been difficult. I mean, my kids are not army age yet, um, or they weren't at the start of this anyway. And I don't have any involvement in the military. I live in a fairly a nice area of Tel Aviv. October 7th, actually, it's interesting. The morning of October 7th, I had woken up early to work on this paper. This paper, okay? This is how long I've been working on it. I woke up at like 6 a.m. and I'm like typing, and then the alarms start going, the sirens, and I'm used to it. It's become a fairly regular occurrence that you every once in a while they'll fire rockets and you have to go to the bomb shelter. And I thought it was a drill. It didn't even occur to me that we were under attack. And then for weeks and weeks, it was the same thing. We were, several times a day we'd have to go to the bomb shelter because Gaza's discriminately firing rockets at us. We had my extended family come and stay with us that didn't have a bomb shelter near, in there where they lived. And yeah, it's completely disruptive, and it's extremely disruptive. I'm a university professor, and so I have students who have already completed their service, but in Israel, you still, you're in reserves, meaning you can be called up at any time. And many of them were called up, and they're still being called up, throughout this entire period. It's just, plucked out, people are just sort of plucked at random out of their lives, and they have to go and spend weeks or months, oftentimes fighting on the front lines. So it's been extremely disruptive. And then with Hezbollah, we were told there are 150,000 rockets that could keep us in the bomb shelters for weeks, not coming up and down, going down a couple of times a day, but staying in the bomb shelter for weeks on end. And then it turned out it was nothing. And then, with Iran, they have this threatening arsenal and these huge missiles. And it was a different experience with them, because at least with the Hezbollah rockets and the Hamas rockets, they're not as large, so they don't do as much damage. But with the Iranian rockets, there was some serious damage that was done. It wasn't anything. There's all kinds of propaganda about the damage that they caused and all of this, and there's just so much lies. That's really been for me the worst thing is just the lies about Israel and about Jews, and the sort of these deep-seated stereotypes about Jews that are lay dormant. They can lay dormant for centuries, and then they just sort of, it's no coincidence that the same types of lies that are believed about Israel and Israelis are the same types of lies that are, it's told and believed about Jews for hundreds of years. For example, many people still believe that Israelis got placebo vaccines, that this whole thing of Netanyahu getting a vaccine supply to Israel was just a big show. And I hope this study, is evidence that no, it wasn't a show. And on my Substack, I have a Substack. When I posted about this, I have a link to one of the very first documentaries that was done about the harms of the COVID-19 vaccines. It was done in Israel because we were the first ones to feel the brunt of it, the first ones to become aware of it, and the first ones to try to really raise awareness of it to the world at large. And this woman dropped everything and made a documentary documenting the harms, the people that were harmed by these vaccines. And it's called I think the Testimonies Project or something like that. Anyway, the link is on my Substack, researchrebel.substack.com. I have a post about this paper on pregnancy loss. You can find the link and watch it. It has English subtitles. It's amazing. So yeah, that's sort of the boots on the ground.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Josh. So people heard your Substack, and you're also on X at JoshG99. And you can find me at Dr. Randall Bock. And I also have my webpage is randybock.com, B-O-C-K. And you can find my Substack at RandDoctor. A lot of interesting stuff there. I recommend you go see it. But as far as today's show goes, I would like to thank all of you for sticking through. I think it's been very enlightening. I certainly learned a lot from Josh Guetzkow, and I recommend you follow him and help support him in his work. And that's all for today.